Good evening, good day, everybody, and welcome to the 301st episode of the Ask Abhijit show. I hope you're all doing great. Let's see who all is there on the live chat. This is going to be a session in which I am going to take questions that you have asked in the comments with the hashtag Ask Abhijit. So I'm going to take history questions today that you have asked in the comments. And if there is time, I will take some live chat questions at the end. Let's see who all is there on the live chat. Rahul Ji, good evening. Lage Raho online. Good to see you. Good to see you. Saurabh Mahajan, feminist slayer. Abhyuday Singh, Rahul Dunake. Um, Sukun Vachar. Okay, Ayush Singh, Pranam. Shreyas Mitra is here from Moscow. Good to see you, Shreyas. Wise idiot. Achedin is here. Aryan Rocking Gaming. Animals for Laugh is here from Mumbai. Good to see you, sir. Amisha Mishra, hello, ma'am. Gaurav Sarkar Arihan. Somi Jain is here from Jaipur. Swapnil Mishra, hello. Ankita ji, hello. Vidhi Manyar, good evening, ma'am. Somesh069, Avinash, Mystic SK, Jai Shri Krishna ji. Hit Patel, good to see you. Ayusin 439, we are so back, aren't we? We are back. Geopolitical Dubai is here from Indore. Good to see you, sir. Vishnu, valorous evening to you. Abhyuday Singh, woohoo. Feminist Slayer, Jai Baba Parshuram, Random Skull, Jai Shri Krishna, Harshai, hello, Shri Vatsa, Random Shots, Komal, Animals for Laugh, Mrigan Kabonia, GK, Feel Strong Man, Random Shots, Chat DSP, Shreyas, DK, Sandy 97, Namaste, K22-ish official, Priyanka Javalia from Gurgaon, good to see you, ma'am, good to see you, Golu Rajput, Jai Bhavani, KK family, from Greece. One second. Hello from Greece. I'm not sure. It'll take me some time. Okay, I'll not try to do that. But good to see you. My Greek is a little rusty. I can still read, but it takes time. Chat DSP Sandy is here. Samyak Space. Good evening. Ashwani Sunil Segal. God was alive. Daksh Spade. Practice Gamer. Indie Achilles. Mayur Nayak. Golu Rajput. मेरा नाम है बुला ओके नमस्ते चैतन्य गोखले स्पेड दक्ष अखुमा सुमन पोतम सिटी Saturn 88 namaskaram Sudhir Kumar event countdown Rahul Mehta Sunil Segal feel strong man Saint Crocodile okay and everybody else I won't be able to greet you all individually as you know but okay who else do we have Bhumi Bhatt Aditya Gupta Parth Prajapati, Mera Naam, etc. Wooden Armor PK, I'm a painter, Tsar, Sid Jain, Bruce Wayne, Sudhir, Daksh. All right, okay, let's get going with the questions. Otherwise, I'm gonna greet you all day, and I would request you all to not take super chats today because I'm going to take questions that you have asked in the comments. So I'll take those today. Let us get going with the questions. What is question number one that we have today? What questions have I picked? Let me see. Let's see. Where are the questions? Here we are. What's question number one? Here we go. Ritik Pawar says, why did no Indian kings perform the Ashwamedha Yajna after 350 AD? Samudragupta did that in 350 AD. What's the deal? Why did no Indian kings do this? Well, first of all, it's not entirely accurate to say that no one did that after 350 AD. Samudragupta, the great Gupta emperor, certainly did that. And he was a fantastic conqueror, as we know. But we had various rulers from various dynasties who did perform this ancient ritual between 350 AD and around the 11th century AD. For example, Vakatak rulers, Chola rulers, Chalukya rulers, various Rajput rulers, etc. And the last ruler that is known to have performed this yagna is Savai Jai Singh II of Jaipur in the 18th century, who did it twice. So you have more rulers after Samudragupta who did perform this very ancient ritual dating back to the Rig Veda, right? But yeah, it's no longer performed. Why is that the case, right? So let us understand what the Ashwamedha Yajna was all about. What was this ritual? What was this ancient ritual? What was it all about? It involved an Ashwa, a horse, So the Ashwamedha ritual was performed by kings or emperors. Here's what was done. So, according to the Shastra, to the Vedas, according to Vedic rituals and prescriptions, a young, powerful male horse would be selected, a stallion, and that horse would need to have certain characteristics. So, the right kind of horse, young, powerful male stallion was selected, and the various Vedic rituals were done with the stallion. Various pujas and vidhis, etc., were done on the stallion, and then on a very specifically chosen date, hmm, the stallion was released. Go wherever you feel like going. Go. And it's not just like the stallion was simply released. The entire, not the entire military, but a significant portion of the king's military would accompany the stallion wherever the stallion chose to go. So the stallion was free to go wherever he wanted. He would not be restrained. He would not be guided. He would be allowed to go wherever he chose to go, and the military would simply accompany him at a at a respectable, decent distance. Okay, and this process would go on for 1 year. 1 full year, the stallion would wander wherever he wanted to go. Now, here's the deal: the stallion would go into neighboring territories, into the territories of neighboring kings, for example. Then, when the stallion enters the territory of a neighboring king, that king would have a crucial choice. Do I allow the stallion to come into my territory, or do I oppose him? If I allow the stallion to wander through my territory and I don't oppose the stallion, then I'm acknowledging the suzerainty of the king who has performed the Ashwamedha Yajna, which means that I become his vassal. If I oppose him, I have to deal with his military. And a king who would have a weak military would not dare to do an Ashwamedha Yajna. So it was about expanding your territory. It was about forcing your neighbors to acknowledge your superiority and your overlordship and their vassalhood. That way, you would very rapidly gain more vassals, or you would defeat your those who dared to stand up against you. So this process went on for a full year. Okay, and obviously you would need a powerful military to accompany the horse, and all those soldiers would have to be supported logistically and so on. So pretty big undertaking. Military, it's a full year-long military campaign essentially that we are talking about. But the pretext is the journey of a horse. Okay, so after a year is over, the horse would then be brought back to the king's capital, and then there would be further set of religious rituals and ceremonies that would go on for about 25 days. The king who had released the horse and now he's got the horse back, he would wear only clothes made from the skin of a black buck. Okay, and he would only sleep on the floor, on the ground, not on a bed. And he would do various yagnas and various rituals for 25 or so days. And then once that is done, the horse would be brought in and the main yagna would happen. And it would not just be the horse himself, but several hundred other animals. The number I recall is 609 animals, apart from the horse. And the horse, the Ashwa, would then be sacrificed. Animal sacrifice. He would be suffocated to death. And then various rituals would then be performed. The king's principal wife would also perform some rituals along with the king or separately from the king. The details we need not go into. There is some controversy about that because of various Western mistranslations. That's a different story. So see, when you are a king that's that powerful, you would not have a single wife. You would have multiple wives, but there would be one principal wife, the principal queen, the main queen, and she would perform the ceremonies that were required. And then the horse would be quartered or divided into various pieces, and the flesh would be cooked. And various other animals would also be sacrificed, and their flesh would also be offered to the gods, and so on. And the king would then give gigantic donations of gold and silver to hundreds of Brahmins, priests, rishis, munis, etc. And all the rituals would have to be done as per strict Rig Vedic standards. All the mantra ucharans had to be done properly, and so on. And a lot of offerings had to be offered to Agni, to the gods via Agni. Hundreds of kilograms of mung beans and barley and so many other things, and obviously heaps and heaps of gold and silver coins. So imagine how expensive this is and how risky this is. First of all, you are conducting a year-long military campaign, and you may be very powerful, which is why you dare to do it. But then you would have to send a significant portion of your military on a campaign wherever the horse leads them for a year. You would have to supply them. You would have to give them all the logistics they need. It's an expensive thing, very expensive thing, to send an army on a military campaign for a full year. That's number one. Secondly, all those heaps and heaps of gold and silver coins, who's going to pay for that? Super expensive. Then you have to donate all of those to various Brahmins, various priests, and the people. You would have to procure hundreds of kilos of ghee and mung beans and barley and all kinds of other things. So it was risky, and it was extremely expensive to perform the Ashwamedha Yajna. That's number one. So only very powerful kings or emperors could afford to do this, or even risk to do it. If you were a small king somewhere with a small army and a small economy, how on earth would you do the Ashwamedha Yajna? If your horse wandered into the territory of a much more powerful neighbor, well, you were in deep trouble. If the horse was stopped and you did not then fight that king, then you were humiliated and your own people would not respect you. So it did not make any sense for a king who was not powerful to do that. And if you were really powerful, then you would incur a tremendous amount of expenditure. But the risk reward thing was also great, because you would end up gaining a lot of territory. That also worked, yeah. So that's the economics, and that's the risk reward calculations of the Ashwamedha Yajna. Now, in the past 1,000 years, we increasingly came upon more and more progressive foreign occupation, starting with the Turkic Delhi Sultanate for a while. Then there was the Mughal kingdom, which eventually became a Mughal empire under Aurangzeb. And then you had the various European occupiers of India, who took away the sovereignty, who defeated various Indian kings and empires, including the Maratha Empire eventually, and we lost sovereignty. And once you lose sovereignty, how on earth do you do the Ashwamedha Yajna? Today we are a secular nation. Our culture, our religion is not. It's given a second class status in the country. So today it's not. Well, the Ashwamedha Yajna no longer has any relevance, right? So that's how this great ancient practice went out of usage. So until the next Ashwamedha Yajna does happen, India is, well, if whenever the Ashwamedha Yajna happens again, that will be the revival of Indian civilization, the proper Indian civilization, not the fake ahimsak Indian civilization, in which you don't do hinsa, you don't do animal sacrifices and all. The Ashwamedha Yajna was a full-fledged animal sacrifice yajna from the Vedic times, from the oldest Vedic times, Rig Vedic times. Your ancestors ate meat. Your ancestors performed animal sacrifices, and more than animal sacrifices. And then what happened is that, there's another factor as well: Buddhism and Jainism. So one of the things that Ashok, the great Ashok, Emperor Ashok, did was he transformed this obscure fringe religious path, dharmic path, into a global phenomenon, Buddhism, right? And Buddhism was all about non-violence. And non-violence kind of appeals to the Indian psyche to some extent, for some reason. And because the Buddhists espoused non-violence, the Brahmins who performed Vedic rituals, they were then branded as animal killers. And that kind of put them at a very disadvantageous position in society. For several hundred years, Buddhism became the dominant dharmic path in India. So, to adapt strategically, tactically, the Brahmins had to become even more non-violent than the Buddhists. The Buddhists still ate meat. The Brahmins became completely vegetarian, right? And because of that, eventually something different crept into what we call Hinduism, which was, you know, Vedic tradition itself evolved as a response to the Buddhist challenge. As a response to that, Vedic tradition evolved to prefer symbolic sacrifice over literal sacrifice. For example, we have this tradition of cracking coconuts, not green coconuts, dry, ripe coconuts. What do dry, ripe coconuts look like? Let me show you what they look like. Give me a second. Let's Google it. Okay. What does a dry, ripe coconut look like? All right, here we go. Ripe coconut. What's it look like? It looks like this. But what about that? Why does it look like that? What does the cracking of a coconut symbolize? It essentially symbolizes human sacrifice. See, there are various gods and goddesses who need to be who require certain kinds of offerings, especially the Kuldevis of warriors, like Kali, like Durga, like Chamunda. If you go to the ancient temples of these great goddesses, I assure you certain things happened in the past that are no longer legal today in those temples. So to replace those practices with something that's more acceptable and palatable to our soft-hearted Hindus of today, we have replaced those practices with the cracking of coconuts. So our society evolved and it became very vegetarian, very soft, very non-violent, very ahimsak, very Gandhian. And Vedic tradition itself evolved to prefer symbolic sacrifice over literal sacrifice. And today, if we talk about the Ashwamedha Yajna and the actual rituals involved in that, most Indians will be like, no, our ancestors would never have done such things. So that's the problem. We have become a civilization of softies, right? Of carb eaters, carb maxers. We don't eat protein anymore. We don't perform the great old Vedic rituals anymore. And that's the problem. Anyhow, so that's the reason why the Ashwamedha Yajna is no longer performed, for these multiple reasons. One is foreign occupation. The second is the secularization of India and the destruction of our civilization and the destruction of Hinduism from India and the relegation of Hinduism to second-class status in India. And thirdly is all of these things, the evolution of Hindu society itself and the the softening. I'm I'm searching for a polite word here. Yeah, whatever's happened, right? That I described. Okay. Okay, next question. Swapnil Mishra says, why is the Algerian War of Independence considered the bloodiest decolonization war in Africa? And what factors made the conflict so violent? Algeria. Does anybody even know about what happened in Algeria? The ghastliest of wars, freedom struggles that happened in Africa. It happened in Algeria. So what's the deal? What's the history? So Algeria, in case some of you are not aware, we will have to consult the map, which is a practice that I have introduced into Indian society. Well, here we go. Here's the map. We're going to look at where Algeria is situated. So we go westwards of India. We cross the Arabian Peninsula. We go west of Egypt. Then you have Libya, and then you have Algeria. This large North African nation, which is mostly empty desert down south, but the major population centers are up north. Right? You have the city of Algiers. You have the city of Oran and many others. So that is Algeria. And if you Go north of Algeria. If you cross the Mediterranean Sea, then you reach France, the country of France. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about Algeria and its struggle to free itself of French occupation. Now, the polite word in European and modern society is colonialism. It was French colonization, just like it was British colonization of India. That word colonization, it masks a brutal reality, which is foreign occupation and plunder. It's occupation, not colonization. So the Algerians fought to free themselves of French occupation. Now, what's the history of this French occupation of Algeria? When did that happen? So it began somewhere around 1830. Around 1830, the French invaded Algeria. And they captured various parts of Algeria, which were at the northern fringes of Africa, the Mediterranean coastline of Algeria. Okay. And the Algerians put up significant, strong resistance. There was this Amir Abdel Bakr or something his name was. You can look up the actual name. The great Algerian freedom fighter from the 1830s and 1840s. So he fought the French for close to 17, 18 years. And he put up a very strong resistance against the French. But eventually, by about 1848, the French were able to capture him and send him into exile or whatever they did to him. So he is taken out of action. He is not executed by the French, but he's captured and sent into exile. I think he was buried in Damascus, in Syria, when he died. And sometime in the 20th century, his body was exhumed and brought back to Algeria against his wishes. He wanted to be buried in Damascus. Anyway, that's a digression. So the Emir is defeated, captured, and then the French colonize Algeria after the defeat of the Emir and the indigenous resistance against French occupation. So that happens in, I think, 1847, 1848, around that time. You can look up the exact dates, right? And once that struggle is over and it's defeated, the French then, what they did is they did not declare Algeria as a French colony. They declared Algeria as an integral part of France. It's an integral part of France. It's not a colony. It's France itself. It's an integral part of France. And then what the French did is that they started this policy of settling Europeans in Algeria, mainly French, but also Spanish people and Italians, and people from Malta as well. So Europeans were settled over time in Algeria, beginning around 1848, all the way until the 20th century, until the 1940s. And these Europeans were called pieds noirs, Blackfeet or whatever in French. So over time, the European population of Algeria became about 10 to 15% of the Algerian population. And they became almost like the majority population in some cities like Algiers, like Oran. In Oran, it was like more than 50% was European. In Algiers, it was about 30-35%. In other cities, it was like that in the northern coast line of Africa. So close to roughly a million Europeans were settled in Algeria, which formed about 10 to 15% of Algeria's population. And the Algerians were systematically repressed. There was this war that was conducted against them. They were relegated to second-class status in their own country. Many of them were sent, the French military, army, air force, everything was used against them. There were lots of killings. By about 1900, almost a million Algerians may have died, okay, because of French policies, let's say. So there was a deal. Now, fast forward to 1945. The Second World War is over. It has just ended. And many Algerians had fought for France. Does this remind you of something? India was again under British occupation, and many Indians fought for Britain in the First and Second World Wars. Why did Indians fight for Britain? Did they see the British as their masters? Did they see themselves as owing some loyalty to the British? No, it was a job. There was no job available in India, so lots of people became soldiers and they fought just to provide for the families. Similarly, many Algerians fought for the French. So the French, they created this two-tier system in Algeria, similar to the South African apartheid system. The French and the Europeans were the first-class citizens, and the Algerians, the natives, were second-class citizens who did not have many of the rights and privileges that the Europeans had. And some Algerians who had become francophones, who had assimilated into French culture, and who had become you could say servants of the French government, they were given more rights. A small minority of people. So by 1945, sometime in May, the Second World War is over. The European theater is over. Hitler is dead. And then many of the Algerians who had fought for France, they started demonstrating in Algeria, asking for equal rights, asking for French citizenship, because Algerians did not have French citizenship, even though Algeria was technically, according to France, an integral part of France. So Algerians wanted French citizenship, they wanted equal rights, and they protested and demonstrated, and the French police opened fire on them. Bang, bang, bang. And then there were riots, and the entire machinery of the French government was deployed against them: army, police, military, air force, navy, everything. About 2 million Algerians were sent into concentration camps. And here is the problem. By 1945, there were about 1 million European origin people living in Algeria, right? But they had not come in recently. They were third or fourth generation people who lived there. They had been living there for 3-4 generations. They regarded Algeria as their homeland because their grandparents and their great grandparents had been born there. So for them, any prospect of the Algerians asking them to leave was an existential threat. So they fought, and they were supported by the French government. So you have this situation which is kind of a civil war-like thing, maybe a war of independence, maybe a war of occupation, whatever you want to call it. So about 2 million Algerians are sent into concentration camps. Hundreds of thousands of them are killed by the French military, maybe tens of thousands, whatever the numbers are. There's a big controversy about what the actual numbers are. So if you ask the French, it will be one set of numbers. If you ask somebody else, if you ask the Algerians, it will be a different set of numbers. So the war, the proper war of independence, starts about 1956, when Charles de Gaulle was the leader of France, and it went on all the way until 1962. And it was brutal. The Algerian freedom fighters even killed Algerians who were suspected of being either neutral or being collaborators with the French. Tens of thousands of people died like this, either killed by the French or killed by the freedom fighters. People caught in the crossfire, people who were sent into concentration camps and starved there or brutalized there. And the French described the War of Independence as a campaign of terrorism, and that's how it was. It was brutal, it was barbaric, it was nasty. But by 1962, the French decided that we have to leave now. So the French withdraw from Algeria, but they sign a set of accords with the Algerian government that takes power. According to that accord, France retains access to certain parts of Algeria until 1965. So the French continued, even after Algeria became independent, the French continued to do nuclear tests in the Algerian Sahara Desert. About 13 or 15 or so nuclear tests the French did there. And after the French left, there was a large number of people who had fought for France, who had served in the French military or government or whatever, who had worked for France. Now, there were reprisals against these people by the new Algerian government, and maybe 130,000 of them were killed. So that was it. If you look at the cumulative death toll, if you look at the figures that Algeria gives us, according to those figures, more than 5 million Algerians died between 1830 and 1960 to 1965. More than 5 million Algerians. They're considered to be martyrs, obviously. And tens of thousands of Europeans and French also died. So it was brutal. There's no war of independence in Africa that has been this brutal, right? It was obviously less brutal than the 1857 Indian War of Independence, in which way more Indians died, but that's a whole different story. So you can't compare the two. But yeah, so that's why the Algerian War of Independence is called the bloodiest decolonization war in Africa. And these are the factors that made the conflict so violent, Right, okay, next. Amisha says, although colonized by Spain for over 300 years, the Philippines never became a Spanish-speaking nation, unlike Latin America. Why is that? Okay, let's once again go to the map and figure out where is this place called the Philippines. So we know where India is. Now we have to go eastwards. So we go eastwards from the Bay of Bengal, the Andaman Sea, the Strait of Malacca. We cross over into the Champa Samudra, which is currently called the South China Sea. And here, west of Indonesia, we have the Philippines, this big archipelago south of Taiwan and north of Sulawesi, Indonesia, and Brunei. That is Philippines. Pretty large archipelago. So the Philippines were colonized by Spain. But the Philippines never became a Spanish-speaking nation, unlike Latin American nations of today. Why is that the case? Right? That's what we have to understand. Now, first of all, understand Philippines is not really very far from the Indosphere. It used to be part of the Indosphere. What is this Indosphere that I talk about? The Indosphere was all of those cultures or kingdoms or regions of Asia that were primarily influenced by Indian culture, by Hindu culture. So the Philippines were very much part of the Indosphere. They were at a point in time vassals of the Chola Empire. And the kings and rulers of the Philippines were called Rajas. So when the Spaniards arrived in the Philippines when the Europeans arrived in the Philippines in the 16th century, the kings that ruled in the Philippines were called Rajas. One of the great Rajas was Lapu-Lapu. And these were Hindus. And they have, Sanskrit inscriptions have been discovered in the Philippines. So the Philippines was part of the Indosphere. So let's quickly understand the context. 1492, what happens? You have Columbus stumbling upon the Americas and believing that he has reached India, which he was looking for. That's 1492. 1498, we have Vasco da Gama, who arrives in India, who discovers India apparently, because nobody had discovered it. That's 1498. In 1520, 1521, you have the fall of the Aztec Triple Alliance, whose capital was Tenochtitlan, present-day Mexico City. And the Spaniards destroyed the Aztec Empire in Latin America. Hernan Cortes was the barbarian in charge of that. In the 1530s, all the way to the 1570s, you have the Spanish destruction of the Inca Empire in Peru. Francesco Pizarro was the barbarian responsible for that. So that's what's happening in the world around this time in the 16th century, right? And then it's around 1500 or something, 1500 something, that Magellan, the Portuguese explorer, discovers the Philippines because nobody had discovered them. And he fights the Filipino Raja, Lapu-Lapu, I believe, and he's killed. Then the Spaniards, they then reach the Philippines and they start colonizing the Philippines slowly, gradually. And it begins at around the 1560s or so, right? And this process of colonization goes on for like Amisha says, more than 300 years, until 1898, when you have the Spanish-American War, which the Americans win. So that's when the American colonization of the Philippines begins in 1898. So from the 1560s all the way to 1898, you have the Spanish colonization of the Philippines. And the Philippines were ruled out of Mexico, which was then called New Spain. Okay. And in the 1820s, Mexico became independent. And once that happened, the Philippines were administered from Madrid in Spain. So now the question is, why did the Philippines never become a Spanish-speaking region. Why is that? Multiple regions, multiple reasons. So the Philippines, like we saw in the map, is a big cluster of hundreds of islands. It's a vast archipelago. And because you have this kind of geography, you're going to have a lot of diversity there. If you go to the Philippines, you will find there's more than 100 different languages that's spoken there. Some of the major ones are Tagalog and so on. But you have hundreds of different languages spoken there. And it was very difficult to kind of unify everything under one language. So one of the principal objectives of the Spaniards was to convert the Hindus of the Philippines to Christianity. So the Spanish missionaries, they decided that instead of teaching everybody Spanish, we will divide ourselves into various groups and go to various islands. We will learn the native language and we will convert them to Christianity by speaking the local languages. That is the tactic or the strategy that they adopted. So they never tried to impose Spanish for the longest time until the 19th century on the Philippines. So eventually, because of the Spanish military superiority and the overwhelming arm twisting power and brutality and all that, they were able to convert the Filipinos, the people of the Philippines, from Hinduism to Christianity. It's only sometime in the 19th century that they imposed a Spanish language education system on the Philippines and tried to instruct everybody in the Spanish language and have everyone adopt the Spanish language. Did not quite have sufficient time to work, right? Even today in India, a lot of people can't still speak English, even though we have been colonized by the East Indian Company since what, 1750? Right, I'm back. Okay, so even today, a lot of people in India still can't speak English, even though we have been colonized by the East India Company since what, 1747, 1757, more than 200 years. And after 1947, we apparently are independent, but we have further imposed English on everyone. And still, the majority of Indians don't speak English, right? After like more than 3 centuries of English presence, significant English presence. So the Spanish did not have sufficient time to be present in the Philippines and impose their language. All they were able to do is to make all Filipinos adopt Spanish names. Fernando Marcos, Imelda Marcos, and so on and so forth, right? That sort of thing. And then the Americans took over after defeating the Spanish in 1898, and then the Philippines became an American colony. And then the English language was imposed once again through tremendous brutality on the Filipinos, who had by now become Christians and who had forgotten their Hindu past. So that is what happened, and that's why the Philippines never quite became a Spanish-speaking nation. What happened to Latin America? Why did Latin America become predominantly Spanish-speaking, apart from Brazil? That's a different case. Why? Why is that? First of all, because Latin America underwent a massive genocide. About 90% of the population of the various parts of Latin America was wiped out through various means, either through massacres, through forced genocide, or through smallpox and various other illnesses that were introduced in the native populations. So approximately 90% of the native populations were decimated, destroyed, wiped out, genocided by the Spaniards, principally the Spaniards. And then the Spaniards settled lots and lots of European origin people in the Americas, in Latin America. And that's why Spanish became the principal language that's spoken in Latin America, apart from Brazil, where you have Portuguese. So that's the difference. Right, next question. Nirvana Shanks says, how did the European colonization of native populations near the modern day region of Mexico, affect the genetics of the general populace of the present time? Right. So, like we discussed in the previous question, the Spanish colonization of the Americas, Latin America, begins with the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Caribbean region in 1492. And eventually, he and his various other compatriots, they take over various parts of Latin America. In 1521, you have the fall of Tenochtitlan, the fall of the Aztec Triple Alliance, the Aztec Empire, at the hands of Hernan Cortes. In the 1530s, all the way to 1570s, you have the destruction of the Inca Empire by Francesco Pizarro. And over time, what happens is that about 90% of the native population is eliminated through various means, either through violence or by smallpox or other old world diseases or whatever. About 90% of the native population, or maybe more, is killed. Genocide, total genocide. Then what you have is that you've got lots of European origin people who settle in these territories. So it was settler colonization after genocide or during genocide. So and then what you have is that you have intermarriage between the two populations, between the native populations who are at the at the lower end of the caste system that was imposed upon them, and the occupiers, the European occupiers, the Spanish occupiers, who are the privileged and the powerful ones, and the higher end of the power differential. So if you look at the Spanish, if you look at the genetics of, let's say, Mexico and other Latin American countries today, you will find that most people are what we call mestizos, which are mixed people, mixed race people. And if you look at their genetics overall, about 50-60% of their genetics, between 45 to 60% of the genetics will be native, and the rest, so more than 50% of the genetics are native, and the rest of it, about 40%, 45% or whatever, is European. Now, that's not all. There is nuance to it. There are two kinds of ancestries. One is the mitochondrial DNA ancestry. Mitochondrial DNA is passed on from mother to children. So mother to children, it's passed on, but male children cannot pass it on to their descendants. Only females can pass it on to their descendants. So the mother will pass on mitochondrial DNA to both male as well as female offspring, but only the female offspring can pass it on to their offspring. That's how it is. So that's why mitochondrial DNA is your matrilineal line of descent. So if you look at the genetics of the people in Latin America, if you look at their mitochondrial DNA ancestry, about 90% of it is native. If you look at their patrilineal DNA, most of it is European. What does it indicate? It indicates that most of them are descendants of children fathered by Europeans with native women. That is a classic symbol of colonization and foreign occupation, where the foreign occupiers won and the local males were wiped out, and the women were enlisted into the business of procreation with the Europeans. That is the deal, right? So that is how the European occupation of Latin America and the devastation of the native populations, how that has contributed to the kind of genetics that you have in Latin America today. Clear classic signs of foreign occupation you see in the tale that the DNA and genetics tells us. All right, next question. Amisha says, if Brazil brought in way more African slaves than the US or Haiti, why doesn't Brazil have a bigger Black or African origin population now? Was forced racial mixing a big reason for that? Right. So if you look at the number of, there was something called the transatlantic slave trade. Let's look at the map. Let us look at the map and understand what this transatlantic slave trade was. So here we have the map. Now we're going to go to the Atlantic region near the equator. Okay, not the North Atlantic, not the South Atlantic, but the region near the equator. And it's around this region, around here, that you had the transatlantic slave trade. So Africans were captured in West Africa, and they were shipped across the Atlantic, and they were then sold in various parts of the Americas, whether it was the present-day United States or Brazil or other territories. That's what happened. Now the question is, how many slaves did these regions acquire from Africa? If you look at the United States, it's the official figures are less than half a million slaves were shipped or were received alive in the United States over time. Half a million slaves, African origin, black slaves in the US. When it comes to Brazil, it's like 5 million plus. So Brazil acquired 10 times, more than 10 times the number of slaves the Americans, the United States, present the United States acquired. So Brazil brought in like more than 10 times the number of slaves, African slaves, than the US, and more than 5 times the number of slaves that were brought into Haiti after the destruction of the Dominican, the people who once lived in Hispaniola, the Carib, the Carib people, the Arawak people. Different story. So, if that is the case, why doesn't Brazil have a much larger black population today? So here's the deal. According to official records, less than half a million black slaves were shipped to the United States. But those slaves were treated, you would say, in a way that was not gonna kill them, if it makes any sense. Look, the slaves were treated as goods. They were treated no different from livestock animals like cattle or pigs or whatever. That's how slaves were treated. They were not treated as human beings by the Europeans. Utterly barbaric practice, right? But when it comes to the treatment of, let's say, animals, there's different ways of treating animals. If you treat them in a certain way, they will thrive and they will reproduce and they will do well, as long as you want to keep them alive. But if you treat animals poorly, animals die, right? So in the United States, slaves were given the kind of living standards where they were treated very harshly, but they were not killed, and they were able to form families and reproduce, and their population actually increased over time. In Brazil, it was the other way around. The treatment was extremely harsh, and the mortality rate was very high. In the United States, the mortality rate was relatively much lower. So in Brazil, you had extremely harsh treatment of the African slaves. So African slaves were shipped to Brazil beginning in the 1500s, the first half of the 1500s, the first half of the 16th century. And by the 1800s, more than 5 million African origin slaves were shipped to Brazil, and they were put to work in cotton plantations, sugar plantations, then diamond mines and other mines were discovered. They were put to work in those mines, and the treatment was extremely harsh. The mortality was extremely high. It was just brutal. It was barbaric. And eventually, by 1888 or somewhere around that time, slavery was officially abolished in Brazil. But the slaves who were freed now, they were given no option to survive. So they were not given any kind of remuneration. They were not given any vocation. They were not given any land that they could work on. They were given no compensation. So very quickly they found themselves in situations that very much mimicked slavery once again. And after 1888, or whichever year it was that slavery was abolished, the Brazilian government then began this policy of encouraging large-scale European settlement in Brazil to whiten the population. So being black was regarded as a stigma. It was regarded as something very inferior. And over time, the populations mixed. So the black people would originally, procreate, let's say, or have children with the native people of Brazil. And eventually that got mixed with the white populations also. So if you see the official Brazilian statistics today, I would imagine that less than 10% of the people of Brazil regard themselves as black or identify as black. So in Brazil, how is race determined? Race is determined by what the person decides that their race is. So most people say that we are not black. We are of mixed ancestry or whatever, but not black. And that's why most people are regarded as not black. But if you look at the actual parentage and ancestry and heritage of most of the Brazilian people, at least half of them have African ancestry, right? So that is what happened. Right. Abisha says, why was the slave transportation process from Africa so brutal when the slavers wanted to sell healthy slaves to make profit in the end? Okay, so once again, we are discussing the transatlantic slave trade. Once again, let's go to the map. Okay, so we had the Europeans had this practice of capturing slaves in West Africa, transporting them across the Atlantic and selling them in places like Brazil, in Latin America, in the United States, and so on. Now, what was this process like? So, most of the slaves came from Western Africa. Today in the US, one of the biggest forms of music is the blues. The blues. What is the roots of the blues? The roots of the blues music is the music of Mali, Western Africa music, Western African music. So it was people mainly from the Western African region that were taken as slaves across the Atlantic. So what was the process like? Let's understand what the process was like. So there would be raiding parties sent into the interior of West Africa, and helpless people would be captured, men, women, children. They would be chained up and forced to march to the various trading ports in West Africa. They would be chained and kept there. They would be kept there in concentration camp like situations until the next ship would come in. Then they would be crammed into those ships in abysmal conditions. Understand this, my dear friends. These slaves, African slaves, were not regarded as human beings by the Europeans. They were regarded as goods. They were regarded as cargo. They were given the same treatment as livestock animals. So it has some value, but it's not human. And its life doesn't matter. That's how they would treat these people. They would treat them as non-human. So these slaves would be chained and they would be crammed into the holds of ships below deck. They would be crammed together. Now, let me give you a rather unfortunate way of understanding this or visualizing this. Okay? Because the Europeans regarded the Africans as the same as animals, let me give you an appropriate comparison. Okay? So, if you to understand the kind of conditions these unfortunate African slaves were transported in. So if you see a pig farm in China, then let's see images. So if you see this, you see these pigs, they actually are living in decent conditions. This is not bad. This is kind of bad. They're crammed together. This is decent. This is bad. The African slaves who were transported in conditions worse than what you are seeing on the screen right now. This is good compared to what the African slaves had to suffer. They had to suffer conditions similar to these. I apologize for showing the way animals are treated to make a comparison, but that is the way the Europeans treated the Africans. That's exactly how the Europeans treated the Africans. So they would be crammed into the holds of ships below the decks. There would be like several hundred of them crammed into a small ship. There would be no place to turn. They would be in chains. There would be no facilities as such to take care of physical necessities. They would be given very little water. They would be given essentially rotten food, typically rice or something like that. And the conditions would be really hot. There would not be proper ventilation because you're traveling near the equator, so it would be hot in the Atlantic. Very poor ventilation. When there was a storm, they would get no water at all. And typically the mortality rate would be, I don't know, between 10% to 50% during a voyage. So the question is, why was this done in this manner? Why were so many people crammed into ships? So many, like animals. Because the traders, slave traders, had this ugly, perverse, horrible logic. They were resigned to the fact that 10-20% of their cargo will die, will perish. So if I'm transporting 108 and 20 will die, why not transport 120? If I'm transporting 300 and 60 will die, why not transport 360, cram 60 more in there? That way, even if 60 die, the rest will reach. So it was not about quality; it was about quantity. As much as possible, as many slaves as possible, let's cram them into the hold of the ship, and however many of them survive, we will sell them and make a profit. That was the deal. The slavers never wanted to sell healthy slaves; they wanted to sell live slaves. It was quantity, not quality that they were after. And that's why the process was so incredibly inhuman and brutal. And today they lecture us about human rights and democracy and whatnot. Yeah, the same people. Right. And Amisha, once again, many white American slave owners fathered illegitimate children with their slaves. How were these mixed race child slaves treated by their masters or fathers? So in the United States, once again, you had slaves who would live on the property of rich white men. And these rich white men would have their own families. Obviously, they would have their wives. They would have a wife. They would have children. They would have a whole household with multiple slaves who would run the household, and you would have slaves who would work on the farms and whatnot. And many of the slaves were women, obviously, right? Female African slaves. And it was not uncommon for these white masters to take multiple female slaves as their sex slaves, as their mistresses. And when you do that, you're going to father children with these unfortunate ladies, right? So many white American slave owners did indeed father children with their slaves. Now, in our culture, there is no concept of illegitimacy. There is no word for bastard in Sanskrit, right? There is a word in Persian, but not in Sanskrit. But in Christianity, you have the concept of bastardy, illegitimacy. William the Bastard, who eventually became William the Conqueror, 1066 AD. That's a different story. So many of these miserable, evil white slave owners fathered unfortunate, illegitimate children with their helpless female slaves. So these slaves, these children that were fathered, obviously were half black, half white. You could see that they were different. They were not completely of African origin. It was very clear. And many of them obviously would have some of the facial features and characteristics of the father. Now, when that happens, it causes a scandal. The wife will be unhappy. Society will see, and then they will talk about you behind your back. It will cause a scandal. So what do you do if you are the guy who has done this? Well, you have multiple options. One is you make the children invisible. Don't bring them out in public. Don't put them in positions where they are public facing, and just treat them as slaves. Second, sell them somewhere far away so that nobody will see what you've done. And if a half white, half black slave arrives on a farm 200 kilometers away, nobody will realize what happened and who the father is. That's the second option. The third option is you actually give them some kind of benefits of being your child. So in some cases, some of these white masters would sometimes, give some kind of unofficial education, arrange for some unofficial education for their illegitimate children. And when they grow up, they would either be given privileged slave positions or they would be freed by the father. That was a minority of cases. In most cases, they would be treated just as slaves and the fathers did not care. They would either be treated as slaves and be brutalized just like every other slave, or they would be sold off somewhere else where the problem would go away. So one of the examples of these prominent white slave owners was the third president of the United States of America, Thomas Jefferson. He had this unfortunate uh, mistress who was an African origin slave, and he fathered multiple children with her. And he never recognized the fact that those children were his descendants. And yeah, that was just the deal. So that is how um, these illegitimate children were treated by their masters, who also happened to be their fathers. Right, next question. Once again, Amisha. So we're going to talk about slavery today. Amisha says, were there white slaves in the US, mid 1800s? You had indentured servants who were white. For example, you would have people who would come from, let's say, Ireland, who would be treated as indentured servants. Now, what's the difference between slavery and indentured servitude? Indentured servitude means you would be a slave for a certain number of years. So let's say you are a poor Irishman and you are being oppressed brutally by the British occupiers of Ireland. You see, today, if you look at the map of the United Kingdom, you have multiple countries within the United Kingdom. One is England. The second is British occupied Wales. The third is British occupied Scotland. And the fourth is British occupied Ireland, also known as Northern Ireland. And there was a time when the British occupied much of Ireland and brutalized the people there. So if you were a poor, impoverished Irishman living under British occupation and you wanted freedom from the goddamned British, from the accursed British, but you had no means to be free, then you would make a deal with the devil. You will tell the guy who has a ship and who is sailing to the US, to the Americas, you would say, sir, please allow me to sail on your ship. I have nothing to offer you, but I will serve you for X number of years once I reach the US. So then they would sign some kind of agreement. The guy who doesn't know, the poor guy who is illiterate, he will sign an X on some document, and that's it. And he would be essentially a slave for 10 years, 15 years, whatever the number of years was. And that was called indentured servitude. It was technically different from slavery, but it was almost the same thing, as long as that contract was valid. And the Irish were not regarded as whites, by the way. The Irish were racially discriminated against. And the way they became white was by discriminating against the African Americans. That's a whole different story. We'll not go there. So you did not technically have white slaves in the US, but you had indentured servants, and you had a caste system in the US. So the people that mattered were the landowners, the rich people. And if you were a white person with no land or whatever, then you were like almost the same in a societal level as a slave. So technically, you did not have white slaves, but for practical purposes and for all intents and matters, it was very similar to slavery, especially for people like the Irish, maybe even the Germans for a while. So from various parts of Europe, you would have people who come in, people who did not speak English and all, they would be treated very poorly, and they would often end up in situations and circumstances that kind of mimicked slavery. So you did have that, but technically they were not slaves, and they, even if they had no money and they were almost on the same level as slaves, they still had rights and privileges that the Africans did not have. First of all, they were regarded as human beings. The Africans were not, and other things as well. So technically, there was no white slavery. Technically, Krishna of the Surinamese Netherlands says, can you give a chronological timeline of the drying up of the Saraswati River, the so-called Ghaggar Hakra River today? Okay, so let's go to the map. Can we discover where this river is? The Ghaggar Hakra River today. Right, okay, let's go to the map. And let us go to northern India. And let us simply search for the Ghaggar Hakra River. Ghaggar Hakra River. And then zoom in there, and there you find it. Ghaggar River. Where is it? So today you have this river, okay, which is kind of a seasonal river. And it is fed from glacial melt waters in the Himalayas. And this is all that remains of the once mighty Saraswati. And even today, in the rainy season in India, the Ghaggar River reverts to its monstrous state, to its majestic state, and it floods. And yeah, it once again, for some time, becomes the mother of floods. So the Ghaggar Hakra River is all that is left today of the once great Saraswati. What is the chronological timeline of the drying up of this great river? So, about 10,000 years ago, this was a major, massive river. If you look at the Paleo Channel, the dried riverbed, in some places it is several kilometers wide. It was a massive river. It was a perennial river. It was a glacial melt water fed river, and also monsoon fed river. In those days, 10,000 years ago, the Indian rainy season was way heavier than what it is today. So you had very heavy rainfall in the rainy season that would totally like transform the river into a beast. And even when it was not raining, it was fed by the melting snows and melting glaciers in northern India, in the Himalayas, and in the Himalayan foothills. So it is a very major river. And how was the river fed? It did not directly emanate from the Himalayas. To some extent, it did. But you also had rivers like the Yamuna and the Satluj that drained into the Saraswati, that served as tributaries of the Saraswati. And that's how the Saraswati was so massive and such a major river, and the mother of Indian civilization to a very large extent. So that's the deal with Saraswati. Okay. Now, what happened is that around 6000 BC, around that time, multiple events happened. Firstly, there was a major tectonic event in northern India. A tectonic event means an earthquake, major earthquake, or a series of major earthquakes. And what effect this had is that it diverted the course of the Satluj and the Yamuna, and now the Saraswati no longer received the waters of these two rivers, and that was a major issue. Secondly, around 6000 BC, which is around 8000 years before today, there was a slow, gradual, monotonic decline in the volume of the Indian monsoon, of the Indian rainy season. So, very slow, very gradual decline in the amount of rainfall that you get every year in the subcontinent. Because of that, from about 8000 years before today, the Saraswati slowly started declining. It was imperceptible. Nobody could really see it happening in real time. It happened over several thousand years. But so the Saraswati is still a major river during the so-called mature Harappan phase, which is about 5,000 years before today. That's when you have the peak of the Saraswati Sindhu phase of our history. It's a fully industrialized, urbanized phase of Indian history, right? And this was all centered around the Sapta Sindhu region, and the major river there was the Saraswati. And you have thousands of archaeological sites that are present today along the dry riverbed of the Saraswati. Then the river starts declining. Obviously, the decline becomes quite visible, and by about 1800 or 1700 BC, the river significantly dries out, and at least in the southern half of its course, it's dry, and it drains out into a big lake in the present day Rajasthan region, and that lake also eventually dries out and becomes the Thar Desert. And today, all you have left is the seasonal Ghaggar Hakra River. So that is kind of a chronological timeline of the drying up of the Saraswati River. And once the river started drying out in a significant way, all the great cities and settlements that had been built on the banks of this great river, they had to disperse, because without the river, without the water that the river gives you, you can't have a civilization. So Indians then had to disperse from this region and go either eastwards or westwards. The ones who went westwards went on to form the Mitanni kingdom and the Hittite kingdom and so on. And the ones who went eastwards went and settled in various parts of India, interior parts of India, like the Ganga Yamuna plains and all that. And they formed the great Mahajanapadas and so on. That is how it happened, and that is essentially an overview of the timeline of the drying up of the great Saraswati River. And because the rainfall or the decline in rainfall caused the loss of this great river for us, it had profound effects on the way we worship gods. During the Vedic days, the Vedic period of our history, we had a pantheon of gods that still exists, but it's no longer worshipped the way it was in the past. The greatest of the gods of the Vedic pantheon was Indra, the great storm god, thunder god. His major weapon was the Vajra, which has two meanings. The Vajra is a hammer, it's also a thunderbolt, right? And Indra obviously is also the god of the rains. And because Indra failed to provide the rains, which ended up killing the Saraswati, I suppose we stopped worshipping Indra. You understand? So all of this ties up together. Right, next question. Feline lover. That's quite a name. Feline lover. Which kind of felines? Cats? Tigers? Saber-tooths? Okay. Feline lover says, wheel imprints found in Sintashta are considered to be an evidence of the existence of a chariot. And Sintashta is credited for the invention of chariots, despite no actual chariot ever being found in the time period it's claimed. Okay. But an actual chariot has been discovered in Sinauli, and it's portrayed by the Westerners and various Indian colonized morons as a bullock cart. Why is there so much intellectual dishonesty? What's my opinion? Okay. First of all, what is the Sintashta thing? Right? So the Sintashta culture is a culture that has been discovered essentially in Central Asia. Let's Google it. It's been discovered in Central Asia, and it is, by the Aryan invasion migration theory folks, it is considered to be the original homeland of the Indo-Iranians. So Sintashta culture. Let's look at the map. What we're talking about. We're talking about this part of the world. So it is Central Asia and almost like Eastern Europe to some extent. It's obviously not very far from India. And if you look at the kind of archaeological findings there that you find, it's clear that the culture is kind of similar to the ancient Indo-Iranian culture. Now you have these burials there. Okay? Burials. And in the burials, they have discovered the imprints of wheels. So they haven't discovered wheels, they haven't discovered chariots, they've discovered imprints of wheels and pigments left behind by wheels, and they have interpreted that as the evidence of the presence of chariots. They said that you have so these are two-wheeled chariots they're talking about. So they said that they have found imprints of two wheels, lined up together. And in those graves, they also find horse sacrifices. So that obviously sounds very much like something the Aryans would do. Our people, us and the Iranians. Our ancestors sacrificed horses. Deal with it. We did. So we have horse sacrifices in these burials. We also have wheels that seem to, we also have imprints of wheels that have been interpreted as the evidence of chariots, and various other artifacts that once again are claimed to tie up in the whole package. It allegedly says that there were chariots that were being used by the Sintashta people there. Okay, so based on this circumstantial fragmentary evidence, they say that the Sintashta culture was the originator, was the discoverer and the pioneer of chariot warfare. Now, what have we discovered in Sinauli? Sinauli chariot, obviously, right? Sinauli chariot. So what's this chariot look like? So this is what it looks like in the museum. This is how it was discovered. Obviously, you have horses and you have the chariot. And the chariot is made of copper, right? Now, if you look at the chariot copper tubes, look at this. Look at the schematic. It's not quite a schematic, but it's kind of like an X-ray of what we have discovered there. This is what it looks like. So inside the Sinauli chariot, you had these copper tubes. The copper was like 99% pure copper. Okay, almost like super pure copper. And you had the entire chassis. The chassis of the chariot was made of copper tubing. Now, why on earth did these folks, our ancestors, make a chariot out of copper tubing? The chassis. Okay, so let's look at this. Car chassis tubes. Check this out. You see this? Modern day car chassis are made of tubes of various kinds of metals. Maybe it's no longer copper, but it's all tubes. Why tubes? Because you don't have any corners, you don't have any right angles. So it is something that that engineers still use today in modern day cars. Metal tubes. And the Sinauli chariot had copper tubes. Essentially ultra pure copper. 99% pure copper tubes. What does pure copper look like? Pure copper roofs. What's it look like? Check this out. This is what it looked like. This was the color of those tubes. So the chariot glowed like this. And it was extremely advanced technology. This was a very strong, hardy, tough chariot. It was not a wooden chariot. Right? Now, why would you make a bullock cart and design it like a Formula One car? Please explain to me. Whatever, 4,000 years ago, whenever it was, 3,500 years ago, why would you construct a bullock cart with the design of a Formula One car with extreme engineering and ultra pure copper? Why? Copper tubes and stuff. Why would you do that? Why would farmers use pure copper instead of wood for bullock carts? Please explain. So clearly, this is utter intellectual dishonesty. And the folks who are behind this are the ones who are the proponents of the Aryan invasion, migration, tourism, picnic theory. And they want to say India did not create anything of any value. It was all brought in from outside. It is to keep Indians colonized mentally. And lots of Indians participate in this and they make fun of the Sinauli findings. Oh, it was a chariot. It was not a chariot, it's a bullock cart. Indians are their own worst enemies. My simple question to you all is, why would you construct a bullock cart with the engineering technology of a Formula One car? Answer that. A race car. Right. Ayush Singh says the term Aryan, please explain its origins. Why it became Aryan when it was originally Arya? Why were the Nazis so obsessed with this term and why did they corrupt it in Western Hemisphere? And why is it that even today when why is it that they equate the swastik symbol as something negative even today? And Shubh says the Sanskrit word Arya refers to a person with a dharmic code of conduct. How was it anglicized to Aryan to become a racial term? Also, why are Persians considered Aryans when they left the dharmic code of conduct? Okay, what does the term Arya mean? The original term Arya, it's a Sanskrit term. It means someone who is noble, not by blood, but by comportment, by behavior, by lifestyle. You have a noble lifestyle. Your behavior is that of a noble person. It was not a racial term. It was a term of civilizational refinement. Okay, a superior person by behavior. That's what it meant. So that is the original term, the original meaning of the term Arya. It was never Aryan, it was Arya. Then the Persians, who are our own people, they migrated westwards, the Parshva people, and they founded what is now Persia. And they started using the term Arya as an ethnic self-designator. So they started using the term as the name of their ethnicity. So for them, it no longer meant noble. It meant us, the people, the Parshva people. We are the Arya people. That's what they started using the term as. So the original term was the Sanskrit term Arya, and then the Persians started using that as the name of their ethnicity. So the only two peoples who have the right to call themselves Arya are the Indians and the Persians. no one else. Okay, now what happens is that um, the Europeans, start when they rediscovered India with Vasco da Gama in 1498. When they started coming to India and discovering India and interacting with Indians and learning India's culture, languages, they started suddenly seeing these weird similarities between Indian languages and European languages. Striking, shocking similarities between Sanskrit and Greek and Latin. And I'll not go into the details because they are very obvious. So it was very clear these languages are clearly related to each other. The words for mata, pita, bhrata, so many words, essentially the same in these languages. And which is the oldest of the languages? Is it Greek? Is it Latin? Is it Sanskrit? It's clearly Sanskrit, right? And Persian language, the old Persian language was like an Apabhransha version of Sanskrit. So there was that also, right? So all of this fit together. And then the Europeans discovered the term Arya. Now, and then Max Miller brought in his Aryan invasion theory, and he force-fitted everything into the 4,000-year time span of the Christian calendar, or whatever it is, the creation of the universe by Yahweh and all that. And that is the beginning of the misrepresentation of Indian history and the beginning of the Aryan invasion, migration, tourism, picnic myth. Now the Germans, their nation is an artificial nation created in 1871 by Otto von Bismarck. And the Germans suffered humiliation in the First World War. And there was this tremendous sense of, we need to do something about this. And that gave rise to the National Socialist Party, Nazi Party, and Adolf Hitler. So the Nazis, they sought to revive Germany. They sought to make Germany great again. Okay? Make Germany great again. MGGA. That's what they wanted to do. And they wanted something to rally the people around. So their idea was that the Germans are the supreme race in the world. The Übermensch, the superior man, the master race. That the Germans and the Nordic people, the Northern European people, are the superior master race. And in the 19th century, because they had discovered, the Europeans, that there are similarities between the Indians, between Sanskrit and these old languages, they also discovered the term Arya. So they started using the term, not Arya, but Aryan, for all the Indo-European peoples who probably, obviously, had descended from a common group, if you look at the linguistic evidence. And because the Europeans were the dominant race in the world at the time, because they'd colonized most of the world, they decided that the origin of the Indo-European people was in Europe, not in India, even though Sanskrit is the oldest language and so on. So they started this revisionism of history, which is now the mainstream history. And if we go against that, we are revisionists today. They started the revisionism of history. So they completely distorted history, and they claimed that the Europeans are the master race, the original Aryans, and the Germans just took it forward. So the Germans wanted this term for themselves, Aryan, because it gave them the prestige of the association with these two ancient civilizations, India and Persia. So they misappropriated this term Aryan. And once again, the swastik symbol, which obviously originates in India, and it has a very positive, auspicious connotation, and it's found essentially almost on every continent. Now, this symbol was also found in Europe. It was a symbol of auspiciousness. If you look at the Finland Air Force, let's look at that, shall we? Okay. Finland Air Force swastika. So the Finland Air Force, it used to have this marking, and this was not Nazi. The swastika was found all across the world. It was always regarded as a symbol of auspiciousness, and it is also a symbol that originates in India. It is associated with Arya culture. So the Nazis appropriated and stole the swastika also. Now the old German flag had three colors: red, black, and white. Okay, old German flag. Let's see. Old German Empire flag. What's it look like? This was the set of colors: red, black, and white. So Hitler took the swastika, he twisted it around, gave it those colors, and made it look like something similar to the communist hammer and sickle. Okay? Communist hammer and sickle. Check this out. Something similar to this, right? So it became a direct competitor to the communist hammer and sickle, the Nazi ugly, evil version, distortion of the swastika, the Hakenkreuz. So that's the origin of all these distortions, misappropriations. And today the word Aryan is regarded as a white supremacist word, which is so wrong. We are the Arya people. We and the Persians are the Arya people, nobody else. The Europeans aren't Arya. They are un-Arya, by the way. An-Arya. Now, Shubh says Arya means a person with a dharmic code of conduct, a noble code of conduct. So that's how it was anglicized to Aryan, etc. But why are the Persians considered Aryans when they left the dharmic code of conduct? Yeah, after the reign of Kurush, Cyrus the Great, they adopted the religion, or the religious version of Zarathustra, which kind of inverted Hinduism, which was a rebellion against Hinduism, and it no longer followed the Vedic ways of life. Before Zarathustra, the Persians followed the Vedic ways of life. But Zoroastrianism brought in a different way of life, which was non-Vedic, which was essentially a rebellion against the Vedic way of life. So if the Persians left the dharmic code of conduct, how can we call them the Arya? Because they chose to call themselves Arya, even though they had left the dharmic code of conduct. Now, if we insist that only people who have the dharmic code of conduct can be called the Aryas, then 99% of people in India can't be called Arya today. Because 99% of Indians, maybe more, no longer follow the Vedic way of life. So let's not be overly judgmental. Abday Gardes says love from Afghanistan. Thank you, sir. Love from Bharat. Before Islam in Kabul was Hinduism. Balkh in Bukhara, you had Buddhism. Now my question is, which religion did the Pashtuns have? For example, we have a Pashtun tribe called the Mangal tribe. I hope you find more. A great question. What was the original religion of the Pashtun people? Who are the Pashtun people? Who are the true Afghans? There are various ways of looking at Afghanistan. Historically, like you are correctly saying, historically, Afghanistan was called Gandhar. The whole region was called Gandhar. Later on, it was called Khorasan. Various words for it. But the original name of the region was Gandhar. And the people who lived there were Indians. And their descendants are the Pashtuns. That is what I can say in brief, but we'll look into this in more detail, obviously. So you have a Pashtun clan called the Mangal clan. You have so many names in Afghanistan which are descended from Indian names, right? If you look at the Pashtun culture, if you look at Pashtun Wali, the code of conduct of the Pashtuns, it is essentially, if you remove the religious elements, the Islamic elements from it, it is nothing but the code of conduct of the Rajputs. It's the same thing. If someone comes to your house as a guest and asks for your protection, then you have to, if required, give your life to protect the person. That is the Rajput code of conduct. It's also the Pashtun code of conduct, isn't it? Now let's look at. See, there's very little. There's very little hard research, academic research that's been done. One thing I can tell you, I don't have the evidence right now, but I've shown that in past episodes a long time ago, the Pashtun DNA, if you look at that, the Pashtuns are essentially an extension of the North Indian population genetically. Now, today, if you look at Afghanistan's genetics, there's so many genetics that are non-Indian in there. You have so many ethnic groups that are not Indian, not of Indian origin, of Turkic origin. The Tajiks are not Turkic, they are Indo-Iranian, that's different. But the Turkmens, the Uzbeks, the Hazaras, these are all non-Indian. And those genetics have introgressed into Afghanistan and even entered the Pashtun lineages. So if we do Pashtun genetics today, it's going to be a mixed bag. But if you did Pashtun genetics 1,000 years ago, it was all Indian. Now let's look at this research paper by an Afghan historian. So it's by a gentleman called Arif Akhundzada on Pashtuns and Pashto in Gandhar, with a brief essay on Pashtun Afghan ethnogenesis. Now let's look at the actual PDF. Right. So this is the PDF, and according to him, Pashto is primarily a Saka or Scythian language. Okay, as you say, if you say so, it's, in my opinion, more of a Dardic language. It has deep linkages with existing dialects in the Pamiri language groups such as Yigda, Munji, spoken in North Chitral, and to its west, it has a close cognatic Persian ancient holy language of Western. Okay, all of that, etc. Gandhar. The Sakas ruled in Gandhar for a decade or two. Their influence is negligible except for the coins of their 4 Hindu kings. All of that. Besides Iranian roots and legacies, Pashto also owes a great deal in formative acquisitions and characteristics to the local Indic Prakrit in ancient Dardic dialects, the formers being the predecessors of current living languages such as Hindko, Punjabi, and Saraki. We have to identify which ethnicities occupied and controlled Gandhar, especially during the last 1500 years after the fall of Imperial Persia to Iran, to Islam, of which it was a key province. The name Gandhar has disappeared off the radar about 1,000 years ago after we know that, with the arrival of Mahmud of Ghazni. Its ancient ethnic composition remained relatively undisturbed for the next 500 years after him, until the advent of the Mughals in 1526, and they messed up the genetics after that. So, the most ancient population of Afghanistan was Indic or Hindki, which spoke Prakrit dialects, now known as Hindko and Punjabi. And then you have Cyrus of Persia and so on. And you have the Paktas, the Paktians, the Paktas of the Herodotus and the Rig Veda, respectively. People who were to later give a Scythian language the name of Pakto, and so on. So you can check this out. This goes into significant detail. They talk about the Scythians and the Pashtun Afghan ethnicity. It arose long after 1526 with the Mughal Empire. The Paktas were mentioned in the Rig Veda also by Herodotus, and so on. The name of the major and dominant Afghan tribal division, the Sarabani, is believed to have a Rajput origin from Suryaban or Suryavanshi. So the Sarabani Afghan tribe or clan is a Suryavanshi tribe. And the legend of their alleged Jewish origins is it's a myth. Okay, it's a myth that has been introduced into Afghanistan at a much later date, and so on. So it's a long story. And that is the deal about Afghanistan and the origins of the Pashtos. The Pashtos were originally warrior clans of India. Some of them were royal lineages, Suryavanshis. Okay, and over time they have been Islamized, obviously, in the past 1,000 years. Especially those who were Buddhists, they Islamized on the drop of a hat. The remaining ones, they resisted as long as they could, even until the 20th century. Even the beginning of the 21st century, you had significant Hindu and Sikh population in Gandhar, Afghanistan. And today, it's not quite the case so much. So, like I said, the historical name of the region was Gandhar. Later, because of Persian and Turkic influences, mainly Persian influences, the region was called Khorasan. Now, what does Khorasan mean? What does Khurshid mean? There's this Persian name called Khurshid, right? The word Khurshid comes from Swara Kshet. Swara means the sun. Kshet means shining. Khurshid means shining sun. If you ask a Parsi person or Persian person, what does the word Khurshid mean? They'll say it means the sun. You can Google it and check it out. You can fact check what I'm saying. What does Khurshid mean? Let's see right now. Meaning of the name Khurshid. Okay? Of the name Khurshid. It means sun or radiant sun. Okay, Swarakshet. It's not Persian, it is before Persian, it was Sanskrit. Swarakshet. Swarakshet became Khurshid. What is the origin of Khorasan? Swarasthan. Swarasthan, the land of the sun. Very similar to Saurashtra. Saurashtra, solar land, solar kingdom. Khorasan was Swarasthan, the land of the sun, the eastern land, the land where the sun rose. That's what Khorasan meant. It had the same name as Saurashtra, which is further south. So these are the ancient connections between Bharatvarsh and Gandhar, of which Gandhar was obviously a part of Bharatvarsh. And the Pashtuns, well, they're our own people, actually speaking. Even today, the Pashtuns aren't like foreigners. Our culture, our way of life, our everything is very similar. You meet a Pashtun person, that person will never feel like a foreigner to you if you're Indian. You won't feel like it's a foreigner you're dealing with. You understand each other immediately, right? Because deeper down, you have the same cultural origins. So that's the deal with the Pashtuns. Okay. Girish, Kumar, and Shubh, was the Kushan Empire Indian or foreigner? If foreigner, then why the Kushans are praised and Mughals are believed to be foreign invaders? Some people argue that Kushans were Indianized. It doesn't make them Indian. What's my opinion? Look. So apparently Akbar is an Indian, but Kanishka is not Indian, apparently. Right? Look, the Kushans, obviously, they came from the Tarim River Basin region, which is present day northern Xinjiang, currently occupied by China. Now, the Kushans, their ancestors were the Tukhara people or Tushara people, whose mummies you still find in the region. And the Kushans, they invaded India because they were fleeing from the Huns, the Shonu. And they displaced the Indo-Greek, the Yavanas, and they took over northern India, eventually much of India, and the greatest emperor was Kanishka. Now, what are the contributions of the Kushans to India? What are the contributions? First of all, they made India immensely rich, wealthy, by controlling all the trade in Asia between East and West. The Kushan Empire occupied much of Central Asia, from the shores of the Aral Sea to the Caspian Sea, all the way to Xinjiang, and all the way into northern and western India. The western coast of India, including Saurashtra, where you have ports that go all the way to that were trading with Rome. So all the trade between India and Europe, essentially Roman Empire, was controlled by the Kushans. And that made India immensely wealthy. The Kushans also traded with China and also taxed Chinese trade, whatever happened to whatever extent between China and Europe. So once again, that made India super wealthy. The Kushans were sun worshippers. And also, they worshipped all other gods you can imagine, super polytheists. And it is alleged, my dear friends, that Emperor Kanishka was a Buddhist, great patron of Buddhism, and the Kushans were great Buddhist patrons, right? Let's fact check that, okay? Let's see this. What percentage of Kushan coinage features Buddhist imagery / symbology / the Buddha? Let's see what the answer is. Well under 1%. Buddhist imagery appears on well under 1% of all known Kushan coins. The vast majority has a vast diverse pantheon of Greek, Iranian, and Hindu deities. Okay, forget about Kushan coinage. Let's say Kanishka. Kanishka's coinage. Let's see. Once again, same question. Buddhist imagery on Kanishka's coinage is extremely rare, featuring on well under 1% of all coins issued by him. His coins had Shiva, they had various Iranian gods, they had Zoroastrian motifs, they had Greek gods because of the Greek, Indo-Greek regions he had conquered. Lots of Indian deities. Well under 1% of the coins have Buddha. But he is portrayed as a Buddhist king. Your historians are a set of inveterate liars. Your Indian historians. Liars, all of them. Okay, so the Kushans, they Indianized completely. They assimilated completely into the Indian population, completely, without friction whatsoever. They were culturally Indian anyway. They may have looked somewhat different initially. After a couple of generations, even that was gone. And they strengthened, fortified India's military. They brought in new tactics and strategies into India's military, standing armies, cavalry, big focus on the cavalry. And they, under Kushan rule, so much culture, new culture. There was this great efflorescence of culture. You had the Gandhara school of arts, you had the Mathura school of art, very different schools of art, and beautiful art, and so much more. And the Kushans did more than anyone I can think of to spread India's culture far and wide. They spread Indian culture into China, all the way to Southeast Asia, all the way to Japan. Hinduism and also some Buddhism. But today it's all Buddhism they talk about, right? So they furthered the Indian national interest. They took care of India's national security, civilization, security. They enhanced India's economy significantly, and they spread India's culture far and wide. But they are still foreigners. But Akbar is Indian. So, I mean, what logic do we have there, right? Doesn't make any sense. Okay. Meet Mystery says, how did the Hyksos period change Egyptian military organization and foreign policy? The Hyksos period. So, Egypt, around 1800 BC, around that time, maybe 1700 BC, probably somewhere around 1800 BC, was gradually invaded by a bunch of people who came from God knows where, who came from what is present in the region of Israel. Let's once again go to the maps. Okay, maps. And let's see where is Egypt and where is Israel today. So we have Egypt here. We know where Cairo is in the pyramids. Now, if you go to the northeast of that, you have the Sinai region, and beyond that, you have Egypt, Lebanon, all of that. And north of that, you have Syria and Anatolia, which is present day, currently occupied by Turkey. So the Hyksos people, they came from this region, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, that region, and they gradually encroached into Egypt and eventually conquered Egypt. And they ruled Egypt for about a century and a half. So initially, they made some small settlements in the Egypt region, and the Egyptians, the Egyptian kingdom was not very powerful at that time. Egypt had a very isolationist policy. Egypt only focused on national defense, just like India today. Today, India's military is all about defense, defense, defense. You don't hit sixes; you just block the ball, right? That's India's military policy since 1947. Keep defending, keep defending, keep defending. Until the 1990s, India was completely isolated, just like North Korea. Indians had no idea what was happening outside. Egypt at this time was just like that, completely isolated from the world and a completely defensive policy. Because of that, the Hyksos came in and encroached into Egypt and settled down, and they set up cities and all that. Eventually, one of the Hyksos kings, he sent a letter to the Egyptian king, whose capital city was like 100 kilometers away. And the Hyksos king, whose capital, so the two cities are about 100 or so kilometers away from each other. The Hyksos king sends a letter to the king of Egypt saying that you have a big pool with hippopotamuses in your city, and the splashing of the hippopotamuses in your city is preventing me from sleeping. So do something about it. It was an insult, obviously, right? So the Egyptian king, instead of taking that action, he went with his army and marched on the Hyksos territory, and there was a battle. What was the name of the Egyptian king? Let's Google that. Yeah, let's Google this. Last Egyptian king before Hyksos period. What was his name? His name was Senekeretao. Let's take a look at what this gentleman looks like. Mummy. Trigger warning, not pretty. Let's take a look at his mummy. See, it's gonna say that. Why is this blanked out? Turn safe search off. All right, there we have it. That's what his mummy looks like. So he went to battle against the Hyksos, and this is what happened to him. As you can see, the instruments that were used were battle axes. So the Hyksos, they brought in new technology into Egypt. What are the technologies the Hyksos brought in into Egypt that the Egyptians did not have? First of all, the Hyksos brought in war chariots, two-wheeled chariots. What kind of chariot? Chariot drawn by horses. And the chariot would have two people. One was the person driving the chariot. The other was the warrior. So you would have a Sarathi and you would have a Maharathi. What weapons did the Maharathi use? He used a composite bow. Not a standard bow, a composite bow. What does a composite bow look like? Let me show you what a composite bow looks like. Lord Rama bow. What does a composite bow look like? This is what a composite bow looks like. Okay? This is the shape of a composite bow. This is the shape of a composite bow. The Hyksos brought in the composite bow. They brought in the Ratha. They brought in the Sarathi. They brought in the Maharathi. The Maharathi would have a composite bow. He would also have a spear. Another weapon the Hyksos brought in was the parashu, which is the battle axe made of copper. What was the Hyksos religion? Their main god was a thunder god and a storm god. Today's European historians will identify him with the Semitic god Baal. The Hyksos also, is that true? I'm not sure about that. Is that correct? I'm not sure about that. The Hyksos also performed horse sacrifices. The Hyksos came from the region where you would eventually have the Mitanni and Hittite empires. The Mitanni and Hittite empires were ruled by people who spoke Sanskrit, by the way. Anyway, these are all circumstantial connections. The Europeans will say that the Hyksos were Semitic people. So the Hyksos came in, they defeated the Egyptians, and they ruled Egypt for about 100-150 years. Eventually, the Egyptians were able to take over again, and you had the new kingdom of Egypt, which was the greatest, glorious period of Egyptian history ever. You had Akhenaten, you have Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh, you had Tutankhamun, and so on. The greatest, most glorious period of Egyptian history. And if you look at their historical records that they wrote from the time, they speak very bitterly of the Hyksos occupation. They speak about the century of humiliation. And after the Hyksos were defeated, Egypt, which formerly had this isolationist foreign policy, suddenly became an expansionist kingdom. And they used the memory of the century of humiliation to justify their expansionism. Does it remind you of China? I keep saying to you all, history is cyclical. History occurs in cycles. Well, there you have it. So that's kind of how it was, okay? And yeah, it also changed Egypt's military organization. The Egyptian New Kingdom adopted all of the technology, all of the tactics, all of the strategies, all of the organization, everything that the Hyksos brought in. And that made them a formidable power in West Asia. Right, okay. Really now says, can you tell us about the Japanese caste system? Also, why aren't scholars around the world researching on this like they do for the Indian one? The Japanese caste system. So look, any functioning society that's been around for a long time and it's advanced, it's going to have division of labor. It's going to have social stratification. It's going to have various social groups, so various castes. So the Japanese society, before the Meiji coup, the Meiji restoration, it had 4 major divisions in society. 4 major divisions in society. That reminds you of the Chinese system, okay? China for occupations. What was the Chinese for occupations? The Chinese had a four-tiered caste system, four categories of the people. You had the warrior nobles, the Kshatriyas. Then you had the peasant farmers. Then you had the artisans and craftsmen. And you had the merchants and traders. And you also had other, you know, straight off society that you don't mention here. And this is similar to the Japanese system, the Shinokosho. Japanese Shinokosho system, which once again had four major divisions of society. You had the samurai at the very top. The samurai were the Kshatriyas of Japan. And then you had the farmers, and you had the artisans, and you had the merchants, and so on. You had four divisions of society in Japanese society and civilization. But you also had another level of society, which was the outcasts, the Eta and the Hinin. The Eta were called the great filth, and the Hinin were called the non-persons, non-humans. And today these people collectively are called the Burakumin. So the Eta were people who were engaged in very degrading professions like butchery of animals, slaughtering of animals, skinning of animals. So you see, Japanese culture for about 2000 years has regarded killing animals as sinful. It is sinful not just in the dharmic sense, Hindu Buddhist sense, but also in the Shinto culture. The Shinto and dharmic culture are very similar. So killing animals was ill, right? That's how it was. And Japan was a vegetarian society for about 1,000 years. They used to eat fish, but they would not kill animals. And the Meiji coup, the Meiji restoration, forced Japanese people to start eating beef, right? And that led to revolts and a lot of strife in society. It was believed that because the emperor had set the example by eating beef, it was believed by a lot of people in Japan that the gods would now desert Japan and a big catastrophe will come upon Japan. Kind of happened, didn't it, eventually? Yeah. Anyhow, so in Japan, you had these two outcast groups, the Eta and the Hinin. And the Eta were the people who would do slaughtering of animals and the skinning of animals. They would also serve as executioners who would execute human beings, people who were sentenced to death. And the Hinin also did certain other functions in society that were regarded as not desirable or that sort of thing. So these people today are called the Burakumin. And they kind of still are, to a certain extent, discriminated against, allegedly, in Japanese society. Most people will not want their daughters to marry a person from that group. The people who belong to the Burakumin category, many of them are part of the Yakuza, which is the Japanese mafia, that sort of thing, and so on. So that's about the Japanese caste system, but it's not something that's limited to Japan. You had the same sort of thing in China as well. You had the same sort of thing in Europe. In France, you had a social group, an ethnic group, or whatever it was, called the Cagots, Cagots, Cagot. Let's Google that as well. Why not? Since we are doing this, okay. Where is Google? Okay, let's Google this. Cagots, Cagot. So the Cagots were a persecuted minority group in Western France and Northern Spain who were treated abysmally. They were treated horribly. They were not allowed to use the same water as the regular people. They were not allowed to enter churches from the same door, and they would be killed if they married a regular person, and so much more. Terrible discrimination. And no one knows what is the origin of this. You also had the gong farmers in England who were treated like outcasts, and also in France, and so many more examples in various parts of the world where you have these social groups that are regarded as, outcasts or untouchables or whatever. You have this all across the world. And why do scholars not do this? Because that is reserved for Hindus, right? Only India is supposed to be vilified for the so-called caste system. Even though we do not have a caste system, we had a Varna Jati system, which is different from a four-tier caste system. Four-tier caste system was imposed upon India by the British, and it's been now enforced and made into a reality by the government of India today. Right? Today, caste is everything. You get reservations based on castes. In China, everybody wants to become as advanced as possible. In India, everyone wants a backward caste status. Everyone is trying to go backwards in India. So this is the difference between India and China. But anyhow, that's the deal about the caste system. Every country has it. Every culture has had it. It's not like it's something that only India has seen. Okay. Girish Kumar says, was the Maratha Empire a pan-India empire or just a regional power in Deccan? Was the Maratha Empire just a small regional power in Deccan? Let us answer this question by looking at the map. Okay. Uh, High tide of Maratha Empire. Maratha Empire. Let's take a look at the image. So a picture will tell you a million words, right? In 1759 AD, this was the Maratha Empire. Here's a different way of looking at it, right? 1705, you have the Mughal Empire. 1759, look at what happened. The Marathas have gone all the way into Gandhar, parts of Afghanistan. As you can see, this is a gigantic empire. India is not the small piece of land. It's a subcontinent. The Maratha Empire was vast, certainly larger than the Satvahana Empire, certainly larger than the Sikh Empire, for example, right, which came later, obviously. So the Maratha Empire was vast. It was a pan-India empire. The Marathas liberated India from the Turkic occupation. The Maratha Empire brought back Hindvi Swarajya. They liberated Bharatvarsh. Sadly, the British defeated the Marathas, and that's because of that we are where we are today. Right. Okay, next. Sai Bablu says, how did our civilization treat or view the disabled people since its starting days? Disabled people. So it's a nuanced perspective. See, we believe in karma, right? Our culture believes in karma. What is karma? It's a conservation law. It's the law of conservation of cause and effect over multiple lifetimes. That's the law of karma. It's a conservation law. So that's interesting. Now, so according to the law of karma, if you are born with certain characteristics, it's because of your actions in past lives. So if you're super powerful, strong, and great, fantastic person with super intelligence, great looks, and all that, it's because you did fantastic, great deeds in your past life, and that's why you've been rewarded with these characteristics today. It's not like you do something naughty in this life, next life you'll be born as an ant or a fly. It's not like that. That is a superficial, silly way of looking at it. Karma is sophisticated. So if your positive characteristics are the outcome or the fruit of good actions in your past lives, then if you're born with vikrutis or defects or disabilities, maybe you did something naughty or nasty in previous lifetimes, and you're paying for that by suffering through these disabilities in this current lifetime to pay off the karmic rana or debt. That's one way of looking at karma, at disability. But that doesn't mean that you discriminate against disabled people. Disability doesn't mean that you have to have a bad life. For example, in the Rig Veda, there is the mention of this queen who fought a battle. Her name was Vishpala. And in the course of the battle, she lost a leg. So she goes back outside of the battlefield. She has her doctors stitch her up, and they give her a prosthetic leg. And she puts the prosthetic leg on. The bleeding is stopped. The prosthetic leg is put on, and she goes back into the battle. The first ever literary example of a prosthetic limb in human history, Vishpala. So Vishpala became disabled, but that did not prevent her from going back and performing her duty. Another example is the sage, the Rishi Ashtavakra, who had 8 disabilities, but he is regarded as one of the great rishis, right? Ashtavakra. Then you have the example of Dhritarashtra. So Dhritarashtra is the son of what? Pandu, is it? He was the son of. His brother was Pandu. I may not have the details right. So he was blind. He was born blind, and because of that, he could not become the king. And his brother became the king. But his brother eventually abdicated the throne, which is why Dhritarashtra had to become the king in place of his brother. And he was blind. So despite being blind, he became the king, and he had good advisors. He had Bhishma, he had Duryodhan, he had Sanjay who could act as his eyes, and his very loyal wife, she decided to blindfold herself for the rest of her life because her husband did not have the facility of sight and solidarity with him. So Dhritarashtra, despite being blind, was treated very well in society and so on. So you have many examples in Indian history where people who are disabled are treated well. In the Arthashastra, there are specific punishments for people who discriminate against disabled people, and there are various provisions for the for enabling disabled people to live a good life. you know so India has always taken care of disabled people. India has never discriminated against disabled people, disabled in various ways. So that's how we have treated disabled people. I think no civilization historically has treated disabled people the way we have historically. Today it's a different story. Today the West claims to be super disability friendly and all, but we were the OGs, like they say, right? Okay, we've crossed 2 hours. I had made a promise. I made a promise, Mr. Frodo. I made a promise in a previous live stream that I would take up this one physics question that our friend has asked. So I will take up this one physics question, and then I will take up some questions from the live chat. So what is this physics question that Srivatsa asked us? So Srivatsa said that, let's say you have a neutron star. And you take out a piece of neutron star that is the size of a grain of sand. A neutron star, it's got a mass that is more than that of the sun, but it is compressed into a diameter of about 20 kilometers. That is shockingly dense. That is more than nuclear density. And that's why what you have in a neutron star is mainly neutrons only. It has a thin atmosphere of iron plasma, and inside you've got strange, very weird matter which is called nuclear pasta and all. But overall, it's nuclear density, extremely, extremely dense, incredibly dense. So, what if you take a tiny bit of a neutron star, the size of a grain of sand, and you somehow are able to transport it to Earth, and you release it into the Earth's atmosphere? What happens is the question. That is the big question. It's a fantastic thought experiment. So if you take this sand grain piece of neutron star, bring it into the Earth's atmosphere, release it there, will it remain intact? It won't remain intact. See, outside of the gravity that a neutron star provides, that bit of material is violently unstable. It will decompress explosively. It will turn into an exploding fireball, a ball of plasma. Okay? And it will be made of neutron rich matter. And a tremendous amount of energy will be released. Much of it will be released in the form of neutrinos, most of which are harmless, but the tremendous amount of energy. So the question is, how much energy is released in terms of kilotons of TNT? So look, roughly the density of a neutron star is about 10 raised to 17 kilograms per cubic meter. That's one with 17 zeros after it. Those many kilograms per cubic meter. So the mass of a neutron, okay, if you take a grain of sand, let's say half a millimeter, then its mass of that little bit of material is about 20 million kilograms. It's the mass of an iceberg, medium-sized iceberg. And how many nucleons does it contain? It will contain about 10 raised to 34 nucleons. And assuming that the energy released per nucleon is about 10 MeV mega electron volts, you will find that the energetic output is of the order of 10 raised to 22 joules. If you convert that into terms in terms of tons of TNT or kilotons of TNT or gigatons, you find that that's about 5,000 gigatons of TNT. 5,000 gigatons of TNT, assuming 10 MeV per nucleon. So what is 5,000 gigatons of TNT? The most powerful nuclear weapon ever tested was the Tsar Bomba, Russian weapon. Its energy output was 50 megatons of TNT. So one sand grain sized bit of neutron star matter will give you 5,000 gigatons of TNT. That is 1 lakh Tsar bombas, 100,000 Tsar bombas. Another way of comparing, the Chicxulub impact event that killed off the non-avian dinosaurs. It gave off about 10 raised to 23 joules. So the 5,000 gigatons, it's about roughly one fifth of that. So if you release a sand grain sized piece of neutron star matter into the Earth's atmosphere, it's going to have a very similar effect as the Chicxulub impact event. It is not a city killer, it's a planet killer. It will cause an extinction event. It will be a disaster. Imagine that, a sand grain sized bit of neutron star matter, you release it into the atmosphere, it will devastate the world. It will cause an extinction event similar to the asteroid that killed off the non-avian dinosaurs. That's how frightful this is. This is all order of magnitude calculations. I'm not giving you exact calculations because you can't really estimate everything properly, but it's about 5,000 gigatons, maybe 4,000 gigatons, around, that sort of ballpark we're talking about. Okay, I still have many more questions, but I won't be able to take them because we've crossed 2 hours. So let's take some questions from the live chat. Let me take some questions from the live chat. If you have any questions, please go ahead and ask me some. Ayush Singh says Europeans claim a proto-Indo-European language existed 6,000-7,000 years ago, evolving into Sanskrit, linked to Aryan migration. Share your knowledge. I kind of did speak about this tangentially. So when the Europeans arrived in India a few centuries ago, they discovered that, the Sanskrit language seems to be very similar to our Greek and Latin languages, and Sanskrit is far older. So clearly the people of India speak a language that is closely related to Greece, language of Greece, and the language of Italy, original language of Italy, which is Latin, and also similar to German, French, all the various European languages. So clearly this would potentially indicate that all these people share the same ancestry going back many thousand years. That would indicate that all these languages evolved from a common shared language, some which was very ancient, very old, and which may have existed 5, 6, 7, 8,000 years ago. And they called this the proto-Indo-European language. Earlier it was called the proto-Aryan language, but then the word Aryan became evil, right? Because the Nazis used it. So now it's called the proto-Indo-European language. It makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense. That the theories make sense. The logic makes sense. The question is, what is the identity of the original language? That was the mother language of all the Indo-European languages that exist today. They claim there was some proto-Indo-European language. They claim that Sanskrit and Persian are sister languages. They make all these distortions. In my opinion, the proto-Indo-European language is proto-Sanskrit, the older version of Sanskrit, the pre-Vedic Sanskrit. That's how I see it. They don't see it that way and they don't agree, but okay. Right, okay. Next question. Hey. Creative Clips says, did Abrahamic religions like Christianity and Islam form because of Buddhism? Christianity came before Islam. Before Christianity came Judaism. Judaism was originally polytheistic, by the way. And then somehow it becomes monotheistic. There is this movie called The Man from Earth or something. 2009 or something, around that time. Let's Google it, shall we? The Man from Earth. The Man from Earth. 2007, is it? Okay, 2007. Yeah, this one. So in this movie, there's this guy who says that he has been around for like several thousand years. He doesn't die. And he says that he went to India and learned Buddhism. And then he went to Europe several thousand, like 2,000 years ago, trying to spread Buddhism in Europe. And he inadvertently became the catalyst of the introduction of Christianity into Europe, because the Buddhist precepts they were converted into Christianity. It is possible. It is very possible that Christianity is nothing but repackaged Buddhism. Very possible. I will have to look into that in detail because I've acquired a new book somewhere. Where is it? It's by a gentleman called Joseph Nooney, and I have yet to read it, but very interesting um, yeah, idea. So I think it's certainly something we would take seriously. Right. Feel Strong Man is talking about geopolitics. Now that the word deep state, the term deep state has gone mainstream, do you get bored of the repetitive question on deep state in super chats? I I look. It is to a large extent the fault of these YouTubers. Gehra Rajya, this that they sensationalize everything, and they've turned this word into this trite, overused term, right? Uh, I obviously am not the biggest fan of repetitive questions, the same questions asked over and over again. But the thing about super chats is that they at least ask better questions. Yeah, okay. We have super chats. I did not realize we have super chats. Okay, Spade is a new member. Welcome, sir. Thank you so much for becoming a member. Mr. Sid says people say the Middle East is united under Islam, but the reality is that they all hate each other. Iran, Saudi, Syrians, Palestinians all hate each other. What's my opinion? Look, it's complicated. You may have the same religion, but you have different territories and you have different agendas. You have different national aspirations. You've got different agendas, and you've got different ideas of how the world should be. And you may have territorial disputes. You may have old blood feuds. So much more. You may be Shia. You may be Sunni. That is also a factor, right? So yeah, to a large extent, you have this issue in the Middle East. You have the same religion, but it's not like they're all united. Many of them are rivals. Iran, Saudi Arabia, big rivals. Palestinians, nobody wants them. Everybody wants to support Palestine. Nobody wants to give refuge to Palestinian refugees in their country. Nobody wants to do that. So no one likes Palestinians for some reason. Syria, a whole different issue. So you're right, to a large extent, it's like that. Arjun says you should criticize the corrupt babus. What does this have to do with history, sir? We are discussing history. I should do a lot of things, but I can't fight every fight. Do you expect Roger Federer to now decide that he will go and play cricket? Do you expect Virat Kohli to start playing hockey tomorrow? You have to pick and choose your fields and your domains and stick to that. You can't go and fight every goddamn fight in the world. So please understand. I discuss history, geopolitics, science. This is a whole different subject. That is not my fight. That is my choice. I have chosen to focus on these three things. These are very big things. History, geopolitics, science, huge disciplines, huge domains. So I am not venturing into other things. Rahul says recently saw Kantara, was disgusted how they portrayed slavery in our culture for building temples, low-key adharmic things. How true are they? We never had slavery in Bharatvarsh. Never. Slavery is not a concept that ever existed in Indian civilization. I haven't seen Kantara or Kantara 2 or whatever this is. I don't watch these movies. People may praise them or whatever. I don't watch them. I know that I will be super disappointed when I watch these things. So I spare myself that misery and pain. I don't watch any of this. So I don't know what is portrayed in there. I've seen the trailers and all. I said, okay, it is best I stay away from this. If they have portrayed slavery and all that, then they are doing us, our history and our ancestors a great disservice. They are doing our people a great disservice. They are doing our future a great disservice, and they may have or may not have, may not be some kind of agenda behind it. That's all I can say. I haven't seen it myself. Ritik Pawar says, this is the hypothetical question. What do you think might have happened if the painter had acquired nukes before the US? Would he have won World War II? If yes, how would the world look? If he had acquired nukes before the US, he would have won World War II. In that case, everyone would be speaking German today. Ich bin ein Ausländer or something like that. That's what the world order would look like, kind of, you see? And it would be totally different. Maybe North America would be German speaking. Maybe North America would be partitioned between a German speaking region and a Japanese speaking region. Who knows? Anything could have happened. Can't really say. Ankita says, what were the reasons for the scientific and technological prowess of Nazi Germany during the Second World War? The reasons for the incredible, tremendous scientific and technological prowess of Germany during this period of time was the groundwork laid in the 1800s. See, Germany was unified for the first time in its history in 1871 by the Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. So Germany was created as this artificial nation, which never existed before. You never had something called Deutschland before. So it was created in 1871. And the German Empire, it consciously focused on technological excellence, on the best education system the world could ever have anywhere, and industry. Science, technology, engineering, industry, all based on the best education system in the world. They consciously went after this, and they created these robust academic institutions, which were all entirely based on merit and excellence and research output. And that's why quantum mechanics came out of Germany. That's why so many of these advancements came out of Germany. And that's why Germany was the pioneer of the cruise missile, of the ballistic missile, of the jet engine, of the flying wing design, which is now the stealth bomber, and so many more things. Germany was the pioneer of all these things because of the outstanding, robust, excellent education system that they had. Fully research based, fully focused on science and technology, not on the humanities and all that nonsense. They had that also, but separate. And it was purely merit based. That's why Germany became a scientific, technological, and military superpower. It was a culture of excellence and merit. MK says, did India have its version of the Peloponnesian War? No, we didn't have that. We never had city states and stuff, so we did not have it. What is history of women education before the British? Says Ayush Arjun Yadav. Women wrote the Rig Veda. Women were super educated. Women had the same rights as men. Boys and girls got the same education. Women became rishis or rishikas. Like 30, 40, 50% of the verses of the Rig Veda, I'm not sure what the percentage is, were written by women. So that's what we had before the British. The British ruined everything. Pakistan's richest man says, Namaste. Yes, Namaste. Was Buddhism truly a non-Brahmin royal response to Brahmin-led Hinduism, or is that just the modern framing? Buddhism was an obscure fringe movement. It was not a response to Brahminical patriarchy or Brahminical oppression or anything. This is all modern framing. R.C. Majumdar introduced the term Brahminism. What is Brahminism? This is a fake modern word that's been thrust upon us. It was dharma. It was Hindu dharma. The Brahmins were not super powerful people who led the world or something, right? And Gautam Buddha was essentially going against the grain, and he wanted to create a different movement, and that's what he did. And the point is that it was completely fringe. It was completely obscure. No one knew about it, but Emperor Ashok, brought it to prominence for political reasons. And he turned this obscure fringe movement into a global phenomenon. Right? And then the Buddhists went after the Brahmins. They portrayed the Brahmins as what? As violent people, as people who sacrificed animals, and who, all kinds of propaganda was done against the Brahmins. And for a long time, for several centuries, Buddhism became the major flavor of dharma in India, until Adi Shankaracharya once again brought the Vedic, way of life back in India. So all of these things that you're taught, it's all modern framing. It's all Hindu-phobic framing, essentially. Amisha says, how did Rome keep track of who is free versus who is slave? I'm not sure. I suppose they would have had a bureaucracy with records and things. Maybe every rich person who was a slave owner would have records of who were the slaves when they were bought, when they were born, to whom they were sold, from whom they were bought for, how much they were bought for, and so on. I suppose all of those records would have existed, but I am not aware of the details. Feline lover, well, thank you so much. No question, but thank you so much once again. All right, so that brings us to the end of today's session. I know there's way more questions that you all have, but I'm going to have to end it over here. Can't do 8-hour live streams every single time, so I'm going to end it here. And tomorrow we're going to have a live stream in which I will discuss geopolitics. I'll take your questions from the super chat. I look forward to seeing you all there. There is a lot happening in geopolitics, a lot that is very important. So there's a lot to discuss, and I look forward to doing that with you all tomorrow. Please ask me your best questions, and we will discuss the most important issues of the day. Thank you, everybody. Keep asking questions, keep learning, never stop learning, keep raising your standards, and I'll see you tomorrow. Take care. Thank you. Good day. Goodbye. Good night. See you tomorrow.